Hello, ngHouston. So we've had a couple of advanced RxJS talks, and they might have scrambled your brain. Just in case there's anybody who's just learning RxJS, oops, I always have it going on the other screen. So if you're new to RxJS and you're just trying to figure all this out, then this talk is for you, because Cory's going to break it down from the beginning and show us all the cool RxJS stuff. So if you're watching on the chat, go ahead and chime in with questions. Questions are welcome. We like questions. And we'll get started here in a minute. But first, say hi, Denny.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. I've used RxJS a little bit, but I am definitely looking for help and just how to understand how to approach it in integrating it into whatever application I'm working on. So looking forward to tonight.
It's going to be cool. And Cory, you want to say hello?
Hey, Cory Rylan. So front-end dev, and kind of been really trying to figure out how to teach RxJS from a beginner standpoint. So I'm hoping this helps a few people.
We are happy to be your guinea pigs. Yeah, and so you were on, was it last week with Paul Spears? And
Yep.
Paul's great, but he was talking about some pretty advanced stuff, and I think there were some people watching that were just like, what is he talking about? Because I mean, if you know RxJS, you come back and you learn the more advanced stuff. But if you don't really feel comfortable yet with RxJS, then that might have been a little bit more advanced. So we're going to break it down and make sure that it makes sense from the very beginning. It's gonna be awesome.
Yep.
Cool. You want to share your screen?
Yep. Let's go.
Teach us some cool stuff, Cory. I was so tickled when you started hanging out with us, because I've been actually checking out your blog for a long time, and it was pretty awesome. So
yeah, I'm a little
I feel
behind.
like I knew you before I knew you.
Yeah, I'm a little behind on my blog. I haven't written in a month or two. Need to catch up.
Well, this is even better.
Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so kind of disclaimer. I only have a couple of slides. Promise I'll get to the code. So I just have a few slides just to hit some points. So it's not going to be all slides. Promise that.
Cool.
Okay, so this is kind of my presentation. Beginner reactive programming with RxJS. Like I said, front-end dev. You can find me on Twitter. And like you mentioned, I've got a blog. I write all kinds of stuff, Angular and RxJS. So RxJS and kind of what it's meant to accomplish. Really, it's targeted towards this idea of making asynchronous programming easier. So asynchronous code in JavaScript and our UI apps is really common, but there's a lot of challenges with it, especially with single-page apps like Angular. This isn't really isolated to Angular. This applies to React, or even just using jQuery or vanilla JavaScript. But there's a lot of different things we have to consider. So the first thing most devs think about when we say asynchronous JavaScript is like a XHR AJAX call. That call goes out and it's asynchronous. We don't quite know when it's going to come back from the server. Could vary on how quick the server is, could vary on the network conditions, and just several other things. But there's other asynchronous endpoints in a JavaScript application. So we've got things like WebSockets. Some local web storage APIs are asynchronous. And then another one that I think a lot of people kind of forget about is our input fields, like our forms. Those are asynchronous in a way. We don't know when the user is going to react to that form input. So usually we handle that with some type of event mechanism. And then the thing that makes it really hard is they're all inconsistent APIs. There's a million different ways to talk to all these different APIs, and they're all asynchronous. So kind of composing these different features of the web and getting them to work together can be pretty challenging. So what is reactive programming? Kind of the boring Wikipedia definition. Computing reactive programming is asynchronous programming paradigm oriented around data streams and propagation of change. It's kind of a mouthful. Sounds a little bit more complex than what it really is. The main idea of it is being able to react to changes in our application, or like events. So kind of our first use case event, say an AJAX call. We make that AJAX call, and after some period of time, we get our response back. Kind of this X notation is our response from our server. And then our application continues. So our arrow here is kind of our timeline of our application. A WebSocket would look a little different. We'd have a little bit of time period, and maybe we get one push notification from our server. And then maybe some time passes, user is interacting with our app, and then we get another push notification from our user. And this could continue on for the entire lifespan of our application. And then our last example with kind of user input, user click event could be kind of treated in the same mindset. So a single click, we'd get one event. And then maybe a double click, we would get 2 rapid events from each click. So with reactive programming, the idea of how to kind of tame and make this a little bit easier is using a construct called observables. The observable construct or object that we'll be using implements a pattern called the observer pattern. This is something that is coming to JavaScript. It's still in kind of the early stages. It's in a proposal stage. But what we're going to use is RxJS, which is a library that implements this observable pattern. Okay, so that's it for the slides. Jump over to the code. So
Hey, Cory.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask you a quick question? Because I think you touched on something that I heard a long time ago, but I think is really important. Early on, you were mentioning how all those different types of async things are different or have different APIs.
Mm-hmm.
And is it the Observable API that standardizes a way to handle and manage all those different types of events? Is that one of the values of observables?
Yeah, that is one of the kind of core ideas with observables. Is using observables, we can kind of wrap these APIs. That way, when we write our application code, we're only working exclusively with observables. And once you kind of get all your APIs kind of normalized to observables, it's really easy for them to kind of talk back and forth to each other.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
When I first learned this, I thought of it like observable is a promise that you can use over and over, because it's going to wait for data to come back and it's going to notify you. But with a promise, that only happens once, and with an observable, it happens again and again.
Yeah, exactly. So to kind of like start out, what I like to do is just show a regular ES6 JavaScript promise and kind of just show the differences between a promise and an RxJS observable. So we'll make our just new JavaScript promise here. And then in our JavaScript promise, I'm going to make some type of asynchronous event. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a setTimeout function here. And in my setTimeout, I'll give it about 2 seconds, and then I'm going to call my resolve. So with JavaScript promises, it hands you back this resolve function, and you can pass it a value. And then whenever your asynchronous task is complete, we can resolve the value and hand that back to whoever's consuming our promise. So now I have my promise created. I can call the then keyword. And just console log my value. So after 2 seconds, after my setTimeout, my promise will resolve. I'll get the string hello world back. And then my then statement will get called, and I'll see my hello world in the browser. So I'll refresh this little demo here. You see after about a 2 second delay, I get hello world. So this is kind of the most common pattern you'll see people using just asynchronous code with JavaScript. So now we'll look at an observable with RxJS and kind of compare and contrast the APIs a little bit. So I kind of mentioned observables is attempting to come to the JavaScript language. It's not quite there yet. It's still being standardized. So if we want to use an observable, we want to import from the RxJS library. So this observable class is just provided by the library. And then I'm going to make my own observable. I can type here. Okay. And it's very similar to a promise. It's going to look Pretty close. So with a observable, we instantiate the observable class, very similar to a promise. Instead of the resolve function that we get handed back, we get handed back this observer type. So then in my observable, I'm going to create another set timeout, just like a previous step. And I will set that to a 2-second delay. Then I'm going to call on this observer. I'm going to call a method on here called .next. So if you dot off of this observer object, we can see there's several different methods on here, and we'll kind of get to each one of these later. But the one that we're really interested in right now is this .next. So this is pretty much equivalent to calling that resolve function. We're just telling the observable we have a new value, and I want you to emit that to anyone who's listening to this particular observable. So I have my observable, I set timeout. After 2 seconds, I'm going to call my observer and emit the string hello from observable. So with observables, instead of .next, we have a subscribe function. And it works very similar to our .then and the promise. Back to my screen.
Hey, Cory, we have a couple more people that want to jump into the panel. I'm going to have Vernon. He's going to be a little bit late. Pretty interested in this, and I think Lance is going to jump in and join us in a few minutes.
Okay,
so if you see new people jumping in, you'll know.
Okay, so let's see. Save my file.
And then you'll have to start all over. No,
yeah, that's okay. I wouldn't mind. Okay, let's see. Okay, yeah. So I saved my file. If I refresh, after 2 seconds, I get my message from my observable. So if we kind of bounce back and forth between these two files, we'll see that the promise API looks very similar to our observable API. So the reason I kind of show this is just to really emphasize that an observable can do everything that a promise can do, plus more. So then in our next step, we're just going to kind of build on our knowledge here. So with observables, we can do kind of more complex things. It's all about managing events and multiple events. With a promise, you can only handle one event. So once that then function's called and it yields a value, we can no longer use it. It's kind of completed, and we can no longer use it in our application. Observables work a little bit different. With an observable, we can emit several events over a given time span. So what I'm going to do is, with this observable, is I'm going to make one that emits several values. So I'm just going to rename my observable here to interval. I'm going to kind of create this interval observable. And then instead of a set timeout, I'm going to do a set interval that fires every 1 second.
This was a little tricky for me because I started exactly like this, but then on line 9, that observer.next, I really wanted to get that outside, and I wanted to like do the .next, but I couldn't figure out how because I was just learning. So it was kind of, I did later, and I'm sure you'll go over that. But I remember when I first saw that, I was like, how do I get that out of there?
Yeah, that's where like subjects come in. They're super helpful.
That's when I got really good at RxJS, or better anyway than I was.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a variable here, count, and instead of just emitting the string over and over again, I'm going to do count plus plus. So every time this interval fires, it's going to emit a new number value. It's going to increment it. So if we save this, go back to our browser, you can see now our observables emitting several events. So this is where promises and observables kind of diverge. This is where observables become really useful for some of those APIs that have multiple values, like WebSockets or user input.
I love this. And you were talking about how to teach RxJS, and I think just the console log is such, for me, that just made it so much easier, because it, you know, when you're trying to learn this stuff in the middle of an application, it's super confusing. But when you just take it to the console log, and it's just awesome. I think this is good for operators too. When I'm trying to figure out different operators, I just love the console log. It's simple. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, something to emphasize is this example code here has 0 Angular. So we're just learning RxJS here. Well, at the very end of this, we'll kind of show how Angular takes advantage of these APIs.
That's awesome. So it's even if you're a React or Vue or any kind of, it doesn't have to be Angular.
What's really cool about this is once you learn RxJS, it kind of opens you up to being able to solve a large variety of problems in any type of front-end application, whether that's React or vanilla JavaScript or Ember, really anything.
Right. This is so cool.
Okay, so we subscribe to our value, but common use case is we want to kind of unsubscribe. So say, like our WebSocket example, we're getting notifications from the server, and we're letting the user know of these changes, and then at some point maybe the user navigates away to a different page.
Hey, Cory, hold on. Yeah. Can you talk for just a second about that $sign at the end?
Oh yeah, I completely forgot about that. So I renamed my variable to interval here. There's a naming convention that some people follow with observables where they end their observable with a $sign. Personally, in my own code base and on the teams I work on, we don't follow this convention. We kind of leverage using TypeScript to determine what variables an observable by looking at the type. But from a teaching perspective, having this $sign makes it really clear what's an observable, what's not when you first start out. So like throughout these examples, you'll see this $ kind of naming convention used, but it's definitely not required. It would be completely functional if I just renamed this to just interval.
Yeah, I didn't know what to think when I first saw that. I saw some people using it. And you don't have to use it, but it's just kind of to let you know that it's an observable. And I didn't really know what to think, but actually once I started doing that, I really like it.
Yeah, if you ever wrote RxJS in vanilla JavaScript, you'd probably lean on that naming convention a lot more, because you wouldn't have kind of like TypeScript and the IntelliSense feature. You wouldn't be able to just hover over there to know, oh, that's an observable. You'd have to kind of rely on this naming convention even more.
That's awesome. I just saw Lance Finney join our call. Hello, Lance.
Hello, thanks for inviting me.
Hey.
You're always welcome. I always like all the Oasis Digital guys. So anytime they're like, hey, can we come in? I'm like, yeah, you can always. They're awesome. All of you.
Yeah, this is my first time on here. Bonnie and I actually met last year earlier this year at ngConf, and I know Cory because we teach some things occasionally together at Oasis Digital. So, but I'm looking forward to seeing what he says here.
I'm glad you're here. And here's Denny. You might meet Denny at ngConf this year. Woohoo!
Hi, Lance. Welcome.
All right, Cory. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no problem.
We keep jumping in.
No worries. Okay, so yeah, we covered the $ naming convention. That's completely optional. I'm just using it here just to kind of emphasize, which of my variables are observables. So once we subscribe, kind of that scenario where we want to unsubscribe, where user navigates away to a different page, and we no longer want to listen to those events. That's kind of different with a promise. Once that promise finishes its value or emitting its value, we don't have to worry about any type of subscriptions lingering. But with RxJS and being an observable, we want to unsubscribe. So whenever we call a subscribe.
Why do we care? What happens if we don't unsubscribe?
So a couple things could happen. The most common one is going to be you're going to have a memory leak of some sort. Because that event's going to just keep firing. Yep, it's going to still listen to those events, and it's going to still perform whatever actions you have in that subscribe statement, which, depending on your use case, could be good or really bad. And we'll see kind of how to fix that here. So when you call this subscribe, we look at the TypeScript signature here, we'll see that the return type is a subscription. So we can catch this subscription in a variable, and then we can unsubscribe. So in my subscription here, if I dot off of it, we can see there's a couple methods. The one we care about right now is unsubscribe. So if I were to save this code the way it is right now and look at the browser, we'd see there's no values. And that's because I'm unsubscribing immediately. So my observable doesn't even get to fire the first event before it unsubscribes. So let's tweak this code and we'll do a set timeout. And in our set timeout, we'll wait 3 seconds before we unsubscribe. So now if I flip back, I get my first value, my second value, my third, and then I unsubscribe. So I get my first 3, and then my subscription has ended. So I'm no longer getting those values, but there is a bug in this code. Even though I've unsubscribed, my observable that I have written actually has a bug in it. The bug here is that my interval internally is still firing. So to kind of prove this, I console log in my interval. Flip back to my example. You can see I'm getting my values, but even after I unsubscribe, that interval is still firing. So this can be kind of a common beginner mistake when you create an observable. Even though you're creating one, you're unsubscribing, whatever asynchronous task you have in there, you have to make sure it kind of does a cleanup step to remove that interval, or say it's like a WebSocket, you would want to close the WebSocket. So to do that, RxJS has a special API. That API is on our observable. When we instantiate that class, it expects this return function. And this return function is like a cleanup function. Whenever our observable has 0 subscribers, everyone's unsubscribed, the RxJS observable is going to call this function for you. It's just that way you can do your cleanup work. So in my observable here, I'm going to catch my interval in a variable. And then in my cleanup function, I'm going to call my clear interval and hand back the reference to my interval. So now when I've unsubscribed from my observable RxJS, and my observable class is going to call this cleanup function, which will kill and neutralize my interval from running. So I don't get that memory leak.
That was very cool.
Yeah, that's a kind of a gotcha when you first start learning. That actually bit me several times when I first started.
I wouldn't even have caught that. That was a really good, very simple, but you know, like, yeah, that was cool.
Yeah, one thing kind of point out is, you know, we're writing this observable kind of from scratch with our own class. We're setting up our own events, our cleanup functions. We'll kind of see later towards the end of this how Angular uses observables. And you actually, when you use observables with Angular, you actually kind of rarely see a whole lot of code like this because the framework's actually creating the observables for you, and you're kind of just the consumer of them.
But this is what I liked about your blog, Cory, even before I met you, because some of this stuff when you're trying to learn everything and there's always so much new cool stuff going on, it can be intimidating, right? And even before I knew who you were, I would find your blog and you just have a very good way of explaining things and making it not so intimidating. So I like that about you. Don't let it go to your head.
Thanks. Okay, let's see. So our cleanup, we got our memory leak fix. Okay, so then our next step is going to be operators.
Hey, Richard wants to know if the observable still remains instantiated, or can you optionally destroy it in the return?
Let's see.
Good question, Richard.
So like destroy the instance of the observable, like from memory. I'm trying to think how that would be. Let's see. Actually, can you read it one more time? Just trying to make sure I understand.
Does the observable still remain instantiated, or can you optionally destroy it?
The instance remains in memory, so it'll still be in memory here in my variable. So whenever this module goes out of scope, it would get garbage collected. But if you have an async task running in here, it won't get garbage collected. So you have to kind of be careful. That's where that memory leak comes into play. If you do clean up your observable, kind of clear your intervals or WebSockets then that will get more than likely marked for garbage collection whenever this module is no longer used. So like, for example, I had an observable in an Angular component, and I unsubscribe. Whenever that component is no longer used and gets destroyed, it will get garbage collected, and this instance will just go away automatically. Hope that kind of helps there.
Yes, that's awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
And we have Vernon too. Vernon just jumped in and joined us. Hello, Vernon.
Hey, everybody. Sorry I'm late.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
I just got lost trying to get here.
So Cory, with that return function there, anytime you create an observable, are you kind of thinking about what do I need to clean up?
Yes. If I'm creating one from scratch here, yeah, anything I'm doing inside this observable definition, I want to think about what's going to happen if I unsubscribe.
Okay. And did you say that's when there are no subscribers left?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you had 2 subscribers and only one of them unsubscribed, would that callback not be fired yet until the second subscriber also unsubscribed?
The answer is it depends. And that's usually the answer no one wants. So with observables by default with RxJS, every time you subscribe, you're getting basically like a new instance of that observable. They're not going to share the same instance, which is kind of counterintuitive what you normally would expect. So to kind of show that behavior, let me subscribe here.
That's such a good question, because this was something that I didn't understand at all in the beginning, and I didn't even know I was confused. I thought I understood it, and I didn't realize.
So yeah, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to subscribe to this observable twice here. So console log 2. And then in my observable, I'm going to create this variable called instance. And then every interval, actually, yeah, here I'm going to do instance plus. And then a console log. Oops, that's next. I'm just going to next the instance value. Oops, commented out my example here. We can see we get double values. They're not both emitting the same value. That's because every time I subscribe, I'm getting 2 instances of it. They're not actually sharing this same interval. So there's actually 2 intervals running for every, or 1 interval for every subscription. So if I subscribe 3 times, and end up creating 3 intervals. I refresh. You can see I have 3 values.
But it doesn't ever. I thought that the this is confusing for me, because I thought the instance would continue to go up, but it just keeps printing 3.
So here I'm creating the instance outside the interval. So I'm just showing that this observable is kind of creating this function 3 times, 1 for each subscription.
But it's not. But is the instance staying the 3, or am I crazy?
Yeah, it's staying the 3.
Oh, because that's not inside the interval. I got you. I was thinking that was inside the set interval, and I was all
yeah. So when you create this observable, let me just back up a little bit here. You recreate one of these observables. You're handing it a kind of callback function to the constructor. Every time you subscribe to it, each subscription is basically going to get its own version of this function. So we'll have, if I have 3 subscriptions, I'm going to get 3 intervals created. They're not actually sharing that same interval. which is where it gets a little weird when you're first starting off learning, because you would expect if I create an observable and I subscribe to it, say 2 or 3 times, that it's all going to share that same logic. Actually, it doesn't by default. Now, there are mechanisms. We can see in a later step where you can actually add a special function that says, this particular observable, I want you to share that logic with no matter how many subscribers you have. Even if you have 100 subscribers, I want you to share that logic and just make it more performant.
But Cory, what if I don't want it to be a separate instance? What if I want them all to share? What if I want to do that observer next from any of them?
Like call the next from the outside?
Yeah.
So then if you want to call the next from the outside, you would have to use a subject.
You know, when I first started using RxJS, I didn't even know what a subject was for like a while. And I thought I was rocking and rolling with RxJS. And then I learned subject and it was like a whole new world.
Yeah, we can, once I cover operators, I can cover subjects too.
Awesome.
We should have enough time for both, definitely. Because yeah, subjects work pretty close to the same, but they kind of just have slightly different behavior. They're really useful once you kind of get the hang of it.
Yeah, for sure. Danny and I were just talking about that last weekend.
But yeah, so with observables, yeah, every time you subscribe, it's kind of recreating that observable for you. So they don't really share the logic. Now, in a later step, we'll see how we can share that logic. So for example, with a WebSocket, you wouldn't want your observable creating 3 new WebSockets for every subscriber. You would want to just open one WebSocket and have 3 subscribers to that single WebSocket.
I love how you've got these examples like out on each one. You're so organized.
That helps me keep my sanity while I try to learn business. Okay. So next step is we're just going to kind of build more on top of this. So we have our interval. We're going to just kind of keep all this code the same. Let me save this and make sure it all still works. Okay, yep, got our interval. So we've got this observable, it's emitting multiple values. We've got this asynchronous kind of task with our set interval, but it's not super useful just yet. So what we're going to cover next is operators. It's just kind of a fancy word for utility functions in RxJS. RxJS is a pretty big library. It has a lot of these kind of operator functions that let us kind of manipulate the observable values as they come in. So in this demo, I'm actually going to show a newer syntax with RxJS called the lettable operator syntax, or if you've seen the code, you'll see a pipe kind of function. So with older versions of RxJS, we would typically call these special functions just directly off of our observable. So we'd have functions like map and things like that, scan. We'll cover what these do, but we'd have like these special utility functions that we would just kind of dot chain off of our observable. I don't remember exactly which version. I think it was like RxJS 5.5.
Yep.
They introduced a new syntax called the lettable operators. And what this syntax looks like, format it.
Can you explain lettable operators?
Yeah, so lettable operators, I can get, my auto import is broken. That's not helpful. So
that's because you're sharing your screen and you're in the hot seat.
Yeah. So so with RxJS, the older versions, if you wanted to use one of these utility functions, we'll kind of learn what they do in a few minutes. But if you wanted to use one of these, you would have something like RxJS add operator / and then the name of the operator, something like that. Your import would look like this, and then you could just do .map. And that's how it used to work. With the new lettable syntax, our imports changed a little bit. And there's a couple good reasons for this.
But I like having 8 lines of imports.
Let's see, operators. Man, my editor is not cooperating tonight. Okay. So with lettable operators, the syntax changes a little bit. So with the old syntax, basically whenever you import the operator, it was kind of doing this weird thing where it would just dynamically throw that function onto the observable prototype class, which kind of made it hard for our web tooling to make our bundles performant. When we kind of change how RxJS works and use these lettable operators, we import the function and we import it kind of with this direct syntax here. And what this allows is when we build our applications, most of the build tools, kind of like Webpack or Rollup, they allow us to do a tree shaking step. So basically, these tools will kind of look at our imports and they'll make sure that only the things that we import are actually in our JavaScript bundles. So say our Angular CLI application, it's going to look at this import and say, oh, you're only using the map operator from RxJS. Let me just make sure that one function is in your JavaScript bundles when you build for production, instead of adding several operators. So it just allows a little bit better performance for your application. And then there's also a benefit of kind of this newer syntax that since these are just regular functions that just get called, it's actually easier to write your own custom operators with RxJS. And to get a little bit more information on that, the RxJS repo has this doc page called Lettable Operators, and kind of goes over the whys and the reasons behind it, and then kind of what that code looks like. So we can kind of see we have this pipe, and then we pass in our utility functions that we want to use. And then it also even includes an example of how you can write your own operator. Prior to this, writing your own operator, it was a little weird, but with this new syntax, it's actually really easy to write an operator. It's essentially just a JavaScript function that takes an observable as its input and then returns a new observable. So their example here is an operator that, given a number, it will emit the value every so many events. So if you say 2, then every second event, it'll emit the event for you. So this is a really good resource. I recommend anyone just kind of go and read through this. And we'll kind of dig.
Not only does he teach us RxJS, he teaches us the latest RxJS.
Yeah, this recently just changed. So if you're kind of new to RxJS, you'll more than likely see, like across the internet, the older syntax. All the operators I'm about to show, functionally, they're completely the same. So no matter whichever syntax you learn, it pretty much translates across the board. It's just slightly different syntax on how these kind of functions compose together.
It's good to know because it can be very confusing when you're learning something new, at least for me, when you see different examples with a different syntax and it's like, what's going on?
Yeah, so this newer syntax, I believe is going to be kind of the encouraged new syntax, like from here on forward, mainly because like the performance benefits. But if you learn from a different resource that has the older syntax, that'll work just fine as well. Like you're not gonna, it'll work just the same way and you're not learning anything less. Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
A couple things. One thing we discovered is when we switched to this newer syntax, we needed to make sure to update our TypeScript. I think we were on 2.2 or 2.3, and it didn't know enough about typing in that older version when we had multiple different lettable operators within a single pipe to know what the different types were. So if you're updated on the latest TypeScript, it's really good. It knows that if you use a map to change it from an observable of one thing to an observable of another thing, that the next thing in the series is going to be an observable of what you just changed it to. It pays attention attention to that. It's really impressive, but you have to be up to date on your TypeScript.
Yeah, I ran into
mention
the same
with the
thing.
weird quirks about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, with the older syntax, one of the weird quirks about the import is if you imported, let's say, RxJS add operator map once in your entire application, it was added for all your files, which in some ways kind of was cool because you didn't have to worry about importing it everywhere. But it was also a problem because if you forgot, like let's say you were only using filter in one spot, and then imported it in one spot, well then you could remove it from both of those spots and not really realize that you had removed it. So you could leave that import behind and that would not be tree shaken. So you could have all of these operators that were added to your RxJS, added to your observables that were going to be part of your application, and there was no way for anything to know that they could be removed. Your editor or TypeScript couldn't tell you that that was an unused import. So you could theoretically just be accumulating a larger and larger application with no benefit whatsoever. But now you have to, with this newer syntax, you import on each file. So it involves more importing because you can't accidentally get it like you could before, but it makes it much less likely that you're going to get something that you didn't need.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
Definitely.
Hey, Richard wants to know in the chat, are these similar to mixins? Or how are these different? The lettable operators?
Say they're different. Usually like a mixin, you're kind of like composing like two objects or like functions together. An operator, we'll kind of see how it works in a second. Basically, an operator is just a function that takes an observable as like a parameter and then returns a new observable to the next function. So it's just basically calling these functions in kind of a sequential order, just passing the new value on to each of the next functions.
I had a hard time with this in the beginning, and it was funny because Jeff Cross was on here a month or two, it was a couple months ago, and laughed at me, and I felt like a bonehead because he was saying, the async pipe, you don't have to unsubscribe, or you don't have to subscribe, it'll do that for you. And I was like, but I have to subscribe because the value that's inside my observable, I have to do something, I have to format it or manipulate it or run a function on it, and I didn't know how to do that without subscribing. So the operators was another thing that opened a door for me when I learned it. I was pretty excited.
Yeah, you can do a lot with just the plain observable by itself. Like just being able to have this kind of construct and listening to events, it can be really powerful. But then you throw these operators on top of it. Once you start getting the hang of these operators, it becomes even easier to write async code. These operators really make things easy. So
you can basically manipulate the data that's inside the stream without interrupting the stream.
Yep. Yeah, so for example, this operator we're going to use, the map operator. It's one of the most common operators you'll see. So map operator works kind of like a map function, like on an array. So as a value comes in through the event, we're going to map over that value. So our map function is going to hand us the value that came back from our observable. And then we can return a new value to our subscriber. So in my map function here, I'm just going to multiply the value by itself. Let's see. Pick number. Did I mess up my types? Oh, so with RxJS, I am using TypeScript here. So coming from Angular RxJS, this is a little bit more obvious. With RxJS on the observable, it can take a generic type. So it's just simply telling our observable what type it's going to be emitting. And what's really nice about this is when we subscribe to our value, now my editor can prompt me and say, hey, that value you're getting back from your subscribe, it's going to be a type number. So it kind of catches those different bugs. So with my map, it's going to map over that value. It's kind of like a iteration type function over each value. We're going to take that value and we're going to multiply by itself. And then this is just a JavaScript arrow function. So it's going to return that new value and it's going to pass that on to our subscribe statement.
So you don't even have to put the return in here. It knows whatever you do, it's going to go back to the next.
Exactly. I think they call it like an implicit return statement, I think is what it's called. Don't quite remember offhand. But yeah, if you don't have braces with the JavaScript arrow function, it just automatically returns whatever's on this line. So it's kind of handy, a little bit shorter syntax. So if I refresh here, we can see I'm getting my values for my interval. Now we can see it's going through that map function, and every value gets doubled. And that's what gets passed to my subscribe statement. So kind of building on this knowledge, we'll add a new operator called filter. This is another pretty common operator. And what we'll do is we're just going to add this onto our kind of chain here. I'm going to call this filter function. And what I'm going to do is I want to filter out the events, only the values that are even. I'm going to do modulo 2. So if the remainder is 0, I know it's even. And what this is going to do is basically filter out the odd values. So now my subscriber is only going to get the even values. So if I refresh, we can see my operators are starting to work together. So my map is going to double the value each time it comes through. And then my filter is going to filter out all the odd numbers. Now where this can be handy, kind of like the filter example, say you had a WebSocket that was connecting to a server, and that WebSocket had several different notifications to your app. Maybe your user only cares about certain types of notifications. Well, you could use a filter operator to filter out only the notifications that the user cares about.
And as always with JavaScript, the order matters. So if you flip them, then it's going to take the evens and then.
Yeah, so if we flip this, I think this example, they'll be the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you happen to be squaring things, but in other examples, it would matter.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Oops. I lost my stuff here. Okay, there we go.
I think if you change it instead of the modulo, you can like multiply it by 10 or something, and then interval the values. It should.
Okay. Okay, so one thing also, actually before I forget, one thing you'll see kind of as you're learning RxJS, you'll see this in the official RxJS docs. There's several websites that also kind of learning websites that use these special diagrams. They're called marble diagrams. And they're really just a way to visualize what these operators are doing. So in the very beginning, I showed that slide with the X's and kind of that timeline arrow. These marble diagrams is kind of a way to demonstrate that. So for my timeline here, my interval, every 1 second I'm getting a new value, 1, 2, 3, 4. A marble diagram would look something kind of like this. Say, okay, your values are 1, 2, 3, 4. It's going to run through your map function or map operator. And then we're going to get the output value. So that's kind of what our marble diagram would look like. And you could kind of build on top of this. So if we had our filter here, we'd have something like filter, and then our output would look something like this. So that would be kind of our marble diagram for our observable above. So really this is just kind of a way to visualize what that operator is doing. So it's kind of like the input to our map operator. This would be the output.
And marble diagrams have started popping up a lot with, well, not started, but with unit testing too. It's just such a good way. I love the visual way to explain it and learn it.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to try that, but yeah, some people have been able to kind of use this marble diagram technique for their unit tests to like actually test how their operators work, which is really cool.
I think I'm trying to get somebody to come on and show us unit testing with ngRx soon.
Oh, that would be
And
really
we'll be
cool.
talking about that. Yeah, that's I'm working on it.
Okay, so learned a couple operators, map and filter, kind of just to show we can kind of manipulate those values as they come in from our events. This next step, I'm going to show kind of maybe slightly more useful thing we're going to build with our observable. So in this example, we're going to build kind of a little widget here. So it's going to be really small. I've got this little widget. It's going to be kind of a counter widget. If I click this increment button, the value is going to go up. And if I click this decrement button, value is going to go down. We're going to build this kind of this little UI widget with purely just RxJS. We're not going to use any other framework. We're just going to use RxJS. So I'm going to import a couple different operators. And this is where I wish my editor was cooperating and could auto import some of this. Observable. Import this first operator called from event. So this operator works a little different than the ones we've seen. And what this operator does is it allows us to listen to a DOM event, and it's going to take a DOM event and create an observable out of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a document dot get element by ID. I'm going to call it increment. I'm going to listen to the click event of this increment button. So here in my HTML, I just have this button ID increment. And now what this operator is going to do is it's going to listen to the click event on this DOM node, and it's going to basically hand me back a observable. So I'm going to catch that in a variable. Now I've got this handy observable with these click events. So let me subscribe to this and we'll see if this works. So I'll just call .subscribe and I'm just going to console log my value. So as I click my button, you can see it. This observable is actually firing off the native DOM event. Now I have this kind of observable of DOM events. So pretty useful operator. So now I want to make a second one here. And this one is going to be decrement clicks. I'll just make sure this one is all set up. And yep, now we have both events firing. So we've got these two observables that are both firing these events of clicks. So what I'd really like to do is I kind of want to make a single observable of click events. I kind of want to like merge these two streams of events together. It's kind of a common pattern you'll see with RxJS, kind of multiple sources of multiple events. So to do that, what I can do is I can take one of my observables. I'm going to call my pipe function. I'm going to start using a couple operators to accomplish this. So the first operator I'm going to use is the merge operator. The merge operator does kind of what it sounds like. it's going to merge two observable streams together. Now if I pass in the decrement clicks and I call .subscribe, it's going to take the increment click events from one observable, and it's going to merge in the decrement clicks into a single observable that I can listen to. So now if I go back, if I click both buttons, now I'm getting the values of both click buttons into a single observable. So I've kind of merged the two streams.
Can you get it to just print the value?
Yep. Yeah. So the next step would be, we really just care about that value from it. So if we look at the HTML here, in my button, I've got a value attribute, which says a 1 and a -1. Really, that's the part we care about. So I'm going to do is I'm going to refactor this a little bit, and I'm going to just create an observable called clicks. There we go. And then I'll just subscribe to that. So now I have this merge stream. Now I need to kind of pull out just the value of that button. So to do that, I'm going to go back to our handy map operator, import that. And my map is going to hand back an event. So that's like the DOM event you would get with just vanilla JavaScript. Now with this event, I can get a target value, refresh. You can see now I have each value, so -1 + 1.
Yeah, Richard had a good question. You still have the available the identity of the individual tributaries of the merge stream, not after the map, right? Once you do the map, you can't go back and get the rest of it.
Correct. Yeah. So once you've merged them together, it's kind of up to you to determine like which event is of which type. You can't really go back and pull from the source observable.
What if you subscribed again to increment clicks, the original one?
Yeah.
Because you changed that in the click observable,
I don't think so.
but the original one would still be intact without the map.
Yep.
So you're saying like the ability to subscribe to increments in a separate observable and have them merge, like two separate subscriptions?
Right. But this one, once you do the map, or like once you do a filter, then that actual observable is modified.
Yes.
So you're not going to go backwards.
Right. So yeah, each one of these operators kind of change together. So once you get to the end of this, you're going to get the output of those operators. You can't really access the previous values from those operators.
Right.
Now you could make multiple subscriptions, and then you could use a special operator to share that subscription, or you could use something like a subject, and then you could have several subscriptions with several different values from that same observable. Okay, so one last step here. So there's a little gotcha here. When you access a attribute in HTML, so right here we have value 1, value -1, these are always treated as strings. So when we map over this value, we actually want the number type value, so we can add or subtract the numbers together. So instead of just returning the string value, I'm going to do a parse int, and then pass in the string value. So now I'll get a JavaScript number type with a +1 or a -1. So kind of like a little tidbit with the Chrome console, strings are, I think, a black color, and then numbers are blue color. So you can kind of see that's changed. So now I've got my observable stream of click events, and I know which button's being clicked. I know if it's +1 or -1. Now I need a way to kind of total those events together. So to do that, I what I need is like some way to aggregate the values over time. So with JavaScript, a way you would typically do this with, say, like an array, is to use a reducer function. So kind of an example here, a JavaScript reduce function is a way to aggregate the values in the array. So if I have an array of 3 numbers, 1, 2, and 3, I can call this special reduce function to add up all the values in that array. So kind of the API for this reduce function is it takes a function, so that's our first parameter, and then it takes a starting value. So I'm going to tell the starting value of this reducer to be 0. So my first value is going to be 0. And then what the reducer does is each iteration or each value in our array, it's going to call my function. It's going to hand me 2 values. It's going to hand me the previous value or the next value, or sorry, previous and next value. And then I can do something with those 2. So this first iteration, my previous value will be 0 because that's my starting. And my next value will be 1. So I'll get 0 plus 1. And then that value is returned to the next iteration. So now my previous will be 1, and my next will be 2. And it's going to add 1 and 2, so I'll get 3. It's going to return 3 to the next iteration. And then I'll have my previous to be 3, and my next to be my last element, 3. So then I'll have 3 plus 3 to a final value of 6. So this reduce function is kind of an aggregation type function. Now we can take this same kind of concept and apply it to our observable string. We can kind of aggregate the events together to total up our click event values. So to do that, I'm going to create a new observable called total. And I'm going to pipe off my click observable. And I'm going to use an operator called scan. Now scan is basically a reducer function. It's essentially that JavaScript reduce array, but it works with observables. So it has the same API. So my first parameter is going to be total, and then the next value. And what I want it to do is I want to add these together. And I'm going to tell it that my initial value is 0. Now I'm going to subscribe to total. So scan, the first event will start at 0. And then every time I increment, it's going to give me that new incremented value. So if it's plus 1, I'll have 1 and then 0. So I'll get a total of 1. If I click increment again, my new value, my total will be 1 plus 1. So then my total will be 2. So if I go back and refresh, you can see as I increment, it's kind of aggregating those values together. And if I decrement, we can see those values go down. So now I have this kind of increment and decrement function. So now to get my widget working, I just simply modify my DOM here. Now I want to get my total value, which is going to set the div element here in my HTML. So now I have my increment and decrement functions. So I could go one step further and I could even refactor this. I could kind of start to combine these together. Just a matter of preference. Functionally, this would be the same.
We have a question in the chat from Fubar. I like your username, Fubar. How would you set the counter to increment or decrement on a timer so you don't need to click it? Which I'm starting to learn about you, Cory, because every time I have a question, like you were just about to say that. So you're probably just about to tell us.
Actually, I don't have that one.
Oh, well, it's a good thing Fubar asked then.
So basically want to kind of use scan to increment the total values, but instead of clicking those buttons, it uses like the interval example, where it's just
well,
kind of
I
automatic.
think we might cover subjects if we have time, which I think would be awesome if we do have time. So we could, because I think I would say you would do that with a subject, right? If you want to, because actually when I first started learning observables, I kind of had that problem because I didn't know how to do it unless I had, like, I could get it with a click event, or I could even get it from an HTTP. I could make one from the DOM, or I could make one, but I couldn't figure out how to do that .next without, because I hadn't learned subjects yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that the answer to his question would be with the subject.
Yeah. So let me.
But you could. But I don't want to derail you from what you were doing. That second.
Oh no, that's okay.
Okay.
So so say I want to call that next function. Like I kind of want to trigger that event manually without listening to some type of event.
Yeah.
Like programmatically trigger that. And that's kind of a weird thing when you first start learning. You're like, how do I call this next method? Like it's inside the observable. Like I want access to that.
I was struggling with that. It wasn't that long ago. I was like, I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, and there's pros and cons to it because sometimes with an observable, you want that next kind of hidden from the developer. Like that's a hidden, like a private API. Like my observable has the rules to know when that event should fire, and I don't want anyone calling that. But then there's also use cases where I do want people to be able to call that next method. Like I'm using the observable as kind of like a messaging system. Like I want to be able to trigger events myself. And by default with the observable, that observable is kind of encapsulated inside the observable class. You don't really have access to it. So if you want to have an observable where you can call that next function, where you'll want to look is the subject class from RxJS. So the subject is just like an observable. It just allows you to call that next API. So I'll create a variable here, observable, and I'll call new subject. And if I dot off of this, you can see all my different functions are just kind of built onto the observable by default. We can see there's our pipe, but now we can notice we have our dot next. I can immediately just call dot next and just start giving it values. So let me subscribe here. I'm going to subscribe to value. And I can just keep calling next as many times as I want with any value. Whoops, I gotta go to the right step here.
And this is actually the perfect way to illustrate it, because I was going to see, and I just did a lynda.com course not that long ago. And I did basically this, almost exactly what you're doing. So this is cool for me because this is exactly the way I think. But then also you can, if you do a subscribe before and a subscribe after, it's a really good illustration of why you might need a replay or behavior subject.
Yeah, exactly. So with this example here, I'm subscribing before I call my next event. So you can see I get those values out, which is what I expect.
Can you leave that there and then put another subscribe underneath it? And then just change the console log so we can tell like first subscribe and second subscribe?
So let's do second, and this one will be first.
So the second is completely ignored in this situation.
Yep. So what's happening here, and this can kind of be a gotcha or like unexpected kind of side effect when you're first starting with observables, is you're actually missing the events. So what's happening here is I subscribe to my observable or my subject, and this applies to observables and subjects. But what's happening is I'm subscribing to it, and then I'm emitting my 3 events, and then I'm subscribing to it again. Now the gotcha here is I'm subscribing late. So what's happening is I'm subscribing at a later point in time, and I've actually missed those events. So my second observable never gets those values.
The first time I did that, I didn't know. I got really confused, and I was like, "This is stupid," because I didn't know what I was doing wrong there. So
Yeah,
what?
And show what happens. Show what happens if you do a next after your second subscription.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
We'll do next, and we'll do next 4.
Now it works.
Yep, because now I've subscribed, and now I'm listening to the latest event value, so I haven't missed that one.
So what if you want number 2? So there's a couple things. If you want number 2 to get, as soon as it jumps in the second subscription, you want it to get the current value, or you can make it so that it can get all the values from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. So like another way to get the last value, say I don't want to miss those events. Like if I subscribe late, I want you to give me whatever was the latest value. So you can kind of get that same functionality, but instead of using subject, we use a class called a behavior subject. A behavior subject works just like a subject. I can still call next on it. I can subscribe to it, but it requires an initial value. So I'll just give it a string initial. Actually, we'll do 0 because the TypeScript's going to complain about passing numbers through. Okay, so initial value will be 0, and then I'm going to next 3 times. I'm going to subscribe late. I'm going to next again. Let's actually get rid of this so we don't have too many console logs. Now we can see, even though I subscribed late, I get the last value that was emitted from this behavior subject. So I get this next 3. So I'm not missing the latest value. And this is a pretty common kind of functionality behavior that you'll see that's kind of desirable in a JavaScript app. Any questions on that? Anyone have anything to add to that before I move on?
When I first saw Fubar's question, I was going to try to answer it in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to me that what Fubar was saying is, like, imagine that the increment was happening on a timer, but then you were clicking on the decrement, and you could do that. You can essentially get rid of the increment button because there's a static observable creation method. Mm-hmm. And so there are a whole bunch of different ways to create observables, and it's almost to the point of any way you could imagine creating an observable, there probably is an operator for it. So I think Cory is now writing the code to see that.
Yeah. So a rough idea would be something like creating a subject, and then you could do your document get element by ID. How was it on event? Create. Not very good with the DOM APIs, but yeah, you could listen to your event and then call next if you wanted. So like that's another way you could accomplish the same thing. Is that kind of what you were thinking, Lance?
I was actually thinking of just using observable.interval and just having an observable that every 3 seconds, whatever, would increment the merged total, so that, like, instead of increment clicks coming from the DOM, just use, like, you could just use an interval that is automatically operating. So I'm going to post in the chat a URL for what I call the choose your own adventure. There's a little utility in there that when you know that you need to find an observable or an operator, it'll answer some questions and might help you find one. And I couldn't remember for sure that this one was called interval, so I went through the path and it reminded me, yep, interval is the right name for it. So I'll post that in the comments.
Yeah, I think there's like an interval operator actually, isn't there? Is that the one I pointed out? It's like
exactly
interval. And then was it takes in a number and like a return, something like that. And then you can fire every 1,000 milliseconds with an event. I don't quite remember how you pass the value though. But
Yeah. So,
there's pretty much an operator for almost everything. Okay. Okay, so if there's no other questions, I'll cover the last part of this demo. So that kind of covers all the beginner parts of RxJS. So we covered how to create an observable, how to use some operators, how to kind of compose these operators together to do something somewhat useful. And then we also covered subjects and behavior subjects. So kind of being able to use observables more directly for kind of events. Okay, so then the last step is kind of showing how this all works with Angular. So pretty much everything we've covered has just been pure RxJS. So all this knowledge you could apply to any framework. But now we'll see a demo where we use this with an Angular kind of feature. Let me get this up and running. Okay, so we'll go ahead and go over the code while this starts. Okay, so this example is used a lot when you're first starting off with RxJS. This is kind of like the hello world of reactive programming. You'll see this used over and over again. And the reason being is it's just a really good example to show how you can use observables for building out a feature. So this feature here, this is an Angular CLI app, and I'm going to kind of have this type ahead search for YouTube's API. So as I type, it's going to go out to YouTube's API and return search results of YouTube videos. So I don't have it working quite yet, so we're going to go over the code. So I'm going to kind of gloss over some of the Angular bits. That way we can kind of just dive deep into the RxJS parts. But first I'll cover my components template and kind of what it's doing. So here at the top, I've got my form. And my form just has a single text input. And that's my search input that I'm going to use. And then below that is my search results. So I've got my ngFor. And I'm going to be looping over my list of results. And for each one of those results, I'm going to create a link with the title of the video. And then it has a little description snippet, and then a little thumbnail of the video. So then in our component, this is where we're going to have most of our logic. So I'm going to be hitting the YouTube API. And then I've got this little TypeScript interface, just describes what the data looks like coming back from YouTube's API. YouTube's API, it doesn't actually return a direct list of results. It returns an object with a bunch of metadata. And then it has one property on there called items, which then has the list of results. So that's the property we care about. We'll see used in a minute. So in my component, I've already set up a couple of small things. I've got my two properties here. I've got my search form, and I've got the results. This syntax here is just saying that this results is a list of objects. And my search form is using the Angular Reactive Forms API. And we'll see why this is really important in a few minutes. In my constructor, I'm doing a little bit of dependency injection from Angular. And that's to get at a couple of special classes to help me build out this feature. The first one's Form Builder, which is a special service that lets me build out forms. And then I'll use this HTTP client to handle my API calls. This Form Builder, little snippet of code here. So we see our search form property. I use the Form Builder class to create a new form, which has one input property called search. Syntax here, default value of empty string, and I have a validation rule that it's required for it to validate correctly. And just kind of note that search form and search, those property names correspond to the template here. So that's how Angular kind of knows how to wire up my HTML to my TypeScript. Okay, so now we want to build out our feature. So Angular uses RxJS internally in the framework, and a lot of its APIs are using observables. And this can be really powerful, and we can take advantage of it to build out some really cool things. So the first feature we're going to look at that uses observables that's built into Angular is the Reactive Forms. So I have this search form here. And if I access this search form, and I access the search control, so that's my text input search, it has a property on here called value changes. And if we hover over that, we can see that the return type is an observable. So earlier I mentioned that user input can be treated as asynchronous events, and we can actually use observables to take advantage of that. So actually, before I do any operators, let me just subscribe to this. You see, as I type, each value from my input gets logged out. So Angular's Form API kind of leverages observables for me. So now I need to take that value and I need to go out to the YouTube API to get my search results. So I'm going to, we're just going to do everything in the subscribe for now. So I'm going to use HTTP service. And I'm going to take my URL here. Actually, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I've got the code down here, so no one look. Okay, there we go. A little bit of verbose code. Okay, so I'm going to call the HTTP get method. And on my get method here, I pass in the URL of the API I want to hit, and I'm just building up my URL string. I'm passing in kind of the base YouTube URL API, my query, so whatever I'm typing in my user field, and then my API key. So let me subscribe to this. I'm going to console log what I get back from YouTube. If I type in cats, we can see I'm getting back the responses from YouTube's API. So here's my object, there's that metadata I mentioned, and my items. So there's my actual search results. But we kind of have a couple issues. One, we're hitting the API every time I type a keystroke. So that's definitely not what we would want. We'd go through our usage limits real quick doing that. So we're going to use a couple operators to kind of clean up this code and make it a little bit more functional. So our first issue we have is we have this kind of nested subscribe statement. So if you've used promises, you can actually kind of fall into the same pattern with nesting promises. And I think some people refer it as to the pyramid of doom, where you keep nesting further and further until you get this kind of pyramid that goes off the screen. So we kind of want to avoid that. So to do that, we're going to use a couple operators. So the first operator we're going to use is called a switch map. So switch map is kind of like the map operator that we covered earlier. Oops. Is the video still going? Sorry.
It
cut
is.
out for a second.
Can
Okay,
you
cool.
talk a little bit more about, because for me, when I first learned these, switch map was particularly confusing, and maybe because it was switch map and merge and flat map, and there were a couple different maps,
Yeah.
but can you explain that for the beginners?
Yeah, so yeah, there's other names that this has been called in the past. I think merge map was one of them, flat map. There's, I think, some slight differences between the two, but switch map, it's like the map operator, so you can kind of map over the value, but it has a couple extra little features built into it. So the first one, the one that we care about right now, is switch map. Instead of just handing back any value to this special map function, you actually hand back an observable. And where this is really helpful is what switch map is going to do is if we hover over the HTTP GET call, we can see that Angular's HTTP service actually returns an observable. So we actually have an observable that's being returned inside of another observable, which is just really weird. We've got this like nested observable thing going on, which can get kind of confusing when you subscribe to an observable and the value you get back is another observable. It's not very helpful. So what switch map does is it takes the observable that you hand back, so our observable from our HTTP GET, and internally it calls .subscribe for you, and then kind of unwraps this internal observable, this nested one for you. It just kind of unwraps, pulls the value out, and then hands back the value of the nested observable. So if I were to subscribe to this, and let this run, you can see I get my API call. So every time I type, I'm piping that query into Angular's HTTP service, which is going to make my API call. It's going to hand me back an observable with that query from YouTube. And then switch map's going to go ahead and subscribe for me instead of kind of calling me having to manually call that subscribe. It's going to go ahead and subscribe for me. And it's going to take whatever value it gets out of that subscribe, which will be our object here. And it's going to take that object and pass it along to our subscriber.
And
So
I
that's
hate to
kind
keep
of-
asking you questions because we're going to go out of time, but well, actually we're not because we don't really have a deadline, but can you talk just for a second about, or if Lance wants to jump in or anybody else, can we talk about race conditions just for a second? Because I didn't really understand when I first started using, I mean, I understood, but I understand better now. So because the switch map, the reason why you want to use this is because you can accidentally have these things kind of overlapping each other and get some unintended results. But
Yeah,
it's hard to really demo that because unless you can like type really fast.
What Cory has demoed so far is actually on merge map, which used to be called flat map. That's why he mentioned that there's some naming confusion. And what you're talking about is what makes the difference between merge map and switch map. Switch map adds on to that unwrapping capability that if there are multiple calls going out and let's say you send 2 calls out on the same HTTP request. If the second call happens before the first one is done, switch map will automatically cancel the first one for you. I don't know what types of operators or if it's all observables or just specifically HTTP. I've only really used that feature with HTTP, but it's really nice. Like if you don't have something to debounce your input, and so every time you type something, it sends messages. You can see that in your code. You can see that in the network tab that a whole bunch of messages get sent out, but all but the last one will be canceled automatically for you, which really lightens the load for your server, which is nice.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, so if I switch this to the merge map, which does the same thing, it kind of flattens out the observable for you, so you don't have that nested functionality. If I refresh, I'll get the same functionality. If I type cats, I still get my API calls, and I don't have the nested subscribes. But if I use a switch map, it does the same thing, but it gets that extra benefit Lance said. The switch map, it's going to basically cancel out any prior events and it's going to just use whatever the latest event is. So if I save this and I go back to my example and I type cats, did it refresh? Actually, I gotta slow down my network to actually see this happen.
That's why it's kind of hard to demo. And I think it almost seems like it's kind of overwhelming because there are so many operators, but it's not, right? Because if you're learning RxJS, if you learn the basic operators, the map and the filter, stuff like that, then there's so much that you can do with RxJS. And as you learn more operators, like you don't need to learn all those to start using RxJS, but the more operators you learn, the better you get with it. It's just so, like you can do something so specific with a tiny little bit of code that it's really powerful. So the more you you just keep going, you can like start leveling up really quickly. And I think it's great that there are so many, but it's not to be overwhelmed. It's not to be intimidating. It's just the better you get at RxJS, the more control you have, and you can do specifically what you need to do.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so many operators. I don't know, there's probably like 100 or so. I know for me, day to day, even though I've used RxJS for well over a year now, I use maybe 10, maybe. It's probably really down to like 5. I use like the same 5 over and over again. And that accomplishes like 95% of what I need.
Right.
So you can do a lot with just learning a little.
I posted a link for Lance in the chat, but that reactive.io/RxJS, if you scroll down to the bottom of that page, and if you have time, Cory, you could open that real quick and show us that. I love the Choose Your Own Adventure because I was a kid in the 80s and the Choose Your Own Adventure books were like amazing, right? My brothers and I read them all, which tells you what a nerd I am and how old I am. But the thing I like about this is actually, and I had a friend of mine call me. I was driving one time and he was trying to figure out which operator he needed, and he called me and I was out running errands. Keith, go to this page and scroll down and look for these 3 red dots, right? It's, yeah, there you go. See, I always do that. I always do that.
Yeah, it's down here.
Those 3 red dots right there at the bottom are so cool because you could just, it's like a game to me. I think it's fun, right?
Yep, you just kind of go through and it'll tell you exactly what you need. Yeah, it's super useful.
So if you want to use all these operators that are very specific and you don't know all the operators, that's totally fine. Just go to the RxJS site and find the Choose Your Own Adventure and just play the game, and it'll tell you exactly what operator you need. And then if you click on that, sample in a Marvel diagram and everything, and it's super cool.
Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite like documentation features I've ever seen on a project.
Me too. I love it.
Okay.
And I'm glad, Lance, that I'm not the only one calling it Choose Your Own Adventure.
Yeah, I don't know if I came up with that or got it from you or what, but yeah.
I don't know, but I love it.
Okay, so then with the switch map, so it does that flattening kind of effect, so we don't have that nested, but it does that cancellation feature. So if I slow down my network, so like a slow 3G connection, if I type fast enough, even 3G is pretty fast for an API call. If we notice on the network tab, we can see these API calls, one for each key event. We can see that these first 3 were canceled. They're red. What's happening is that switch map, every time a new observable gets returned, it unsubscribes from the previous one and subscribes to the latest one. Basically, it's switching from one observable to the latest observable. And this is what,
and if you still had the merge map would let them all go. It wouldn't stop. It wouldn't cancel the old ones.
Yeah, and that's where you can get the race condition. Because what would happen with the merge map is maybe one of these APIs that came first is actually faster than the last one. So maybe this first one that searched for C arrives last on the network, and it shows the search results for C instead of cats. And that's where you can get those kind of that weird behavior.
So that makes the decision that it should cancel any observable that has not yet, I don't want to say complete, but has not yet returned a value. Like, how does it decide that it needs to cancel rather than let one proceed.
It only takes the most recent one. So like even if you're just doing an interval in a console log, if you have 2, then it's gonna take the last one and it's gonna forget whatever it was doing before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always going to grab that last event, and then any prior one, no matter if it's completed or if it's still firing events, it's going to just unsubscribe from the old one.
Okay.
And the network cancellation feature, what's happening there is Angular's HTTP service, since it's returning an observable, when you unsubscribe from Angular's HTTP observable, when you unsubscribe internally there, it's canceling the network request. It's doing like an XHR abort command.
Okay.
And that term race conditions, and I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory, but not necessarily, because sometimes, especially when I first started learning this, and I still feel like that sometimes. I feel like everybody knows what that means except me, right? But a race condition is basically exactly what we're talking about. It's when you have this stuff all going on at the same time, sometimes you can accidentally put a situation in your code where you need something to happen in a certain order, and that's where you get bugs, because most of the time it will happen in that order, but not necessarily, especially when you would introduce latency. So a race condition is any situation where basically you really have to be careful that you don't want to have that, you're just going to get lucky and it's going to work, but then you have bugs. So this is one of those things to be aware of.
Yeah, and those are not fun bugs to have to try to fix.
Right.
Those are the types of bugs where it works 1 second, then it doesn't work one time, and it works again. Not fun stuff.
I had that a couple times when I first started using Angular, and it drove me crazy because I didn't know how to fix it.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the switch map. So it's kind of doing 2 things. It's flattening our observables so we don't have those nested subscribes, and then it's doing that cancellation feature for us automatically, so we get that for free. Preserves.
Hey Cory, I'm sorry, Lance. Vernon just asked a really good question over in the chat, but they can't see it on YouTube. Can you go back real quick and show them how you intentionally slowed down your network?
Oh yeah.
Because you did it quick, and it's so cool, and I didn't know that either in the beginning. And
yeah, so in the dev tools, if you go to the network tab, over here to the right, there's a couple of network options. You can go completely offline, and then there's this drop down. You can actually slow down the connection. So you can say like it's on a fast 3G connection or it's on a slow 3G. And I think you can even add custom with like custom latency options. But here I just said I want a slow 3G connection. So I want to see what my site would behave if I was like on a phone out in the middle of nowhere on a slower connection.
Awesome. That's such a cool little tool. But yeah, the first time I saw it too, I was like, wait, how'd you do that?
Yeah, it's super helpful for demonstrating this example, because if it's on a fast connection, it's hard to demonstrate that kind of cancellation feature because the network requests come back before I even get the chance to hit that next key.
Yep. Yeah, that was a good question, Vernon. I'm sorry I keep interrupting you, Cory.
No, that's a definitely a good question. Yeah, it's super helpful. Okay, so there's a couple other things we could do to kind of improve this code a little bit. So I've got my query, I've got my search results, but I want to add just a little bit more logic to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new operator called Debounce time. And this is a really helpful operator. What this is going to do is it's going to debounce the events on the key events. So what's going to happen is this observable is going to wait 500 milliseconds after all the events have fired, and then allow the latest value to continue. And what this gets me is, if I go back to my working example and type in cats, you can see only one API call went out. So the switch map canceled the prior request, but it only canceled it at the browser level. Once those network requests go out, they're still hitting the server, which still would use our usage on that server. So we want to use this debounce to basically tell our observable, just wait on the events, wait about 500 milliseconds. And then after 500 milliseconds, if you haven't received a new value, then take the latest value and pass it along to your subscriber. So now I just get one API call for cats instead of 4 API calls in the switch map having to cancel the previous ones.
The first time I used Debounce, I got confused because it returned an observable.
Mhm.
And that's because it's because there is an operator called Debounce, and then there's an operator called Debounce time. Actually, no, it wanted me to pass in an observable, I think, and I was confused. But Debounce time to me is so much simpler because you just pass in the number.
Mhm.
Whatever you want your delay to be. Super simple. I love it.
So then we could add a couple more operators just to kind of really make this search kind of more robust. Another thing we could do if we wanted is we could actually, we'll do this one. This operator here, distinct until changed. So this is an operator you'll see a little bit more of in ngRx, the state management library for Angular. This operator is a special operator that kind of just takes that observable's performance just up a little bit more. So what this operator does is it looks at the previous value that was emitted and then the current value that was just emitted. And if both those values are the same, then it doesn't emit a new value. If they're different, then it emits the new different value. Now, where this is helpful for our search feature is if I go back to my demo, I hit cats, but then I backspace and hit S again. Like I'm unsure if I would just want a single cat video or I want a video just full of cats. If I just go back and forth, you can see no search call went out. And what's happening is that distinct until change is looking at the previous value and then the next value. So the previous value was cats. I backspace and then I added S again. The debounce returned cats a second time. That distinct till change looked at my old value of cats and my new value of cats and just compared them. It says, is this one equal to this one? Yeah, they're the same thing. So you know what? I'm not going to emit a new value. And that actually saves me an API request. Now I'm not searching cats again, even though I already have the cats search result. So that's just kind of another operator you can kind of add to your tool belt to just add a little bit more performance and make sure that you're not firing events on the same values.
You know what's crazy, Cory, and it's uncanny? We must be kindred spirits because I flew out to California back in October and recorded a lynda.com course.
Mm-hmm.
And our demos are so close to each other that I actually searched for cats. Seriously. So I just want you to know that I did that back in October and I was not plagiarizing you, but it's funny how close our minds work.
That's what the internet's for. It's for cat videos.
But this one's free for people, so yeah. So don't tell my viewers that you could just watch this for free. This is awesome, though. But I thought it was funny when you were searching for cats. I was like, that's great.
Okay, so one last operator, and this is kind of just a little extra tidbit if you really just kind of want to impress your coworkers. So if you want to take your search feature kind of one step further, you could add a filter if you wanted. And then adding this filter, you could say search values need at least 3 characters. I don't want to bog down my server with API calls for search terms that only have 2 characters. So I'm not going to get a good search result anyways because there's only 2 characters. So if I wanted, I could add a filter here, and anything that's less than 2 characters is just going to get ignored. So if I type cat, if I type CA, I'm not going to get anything, but the moment I type in 3, it passes the filter check and makes my API call. So now I've got my search feature working. Now I need to wire it up to my component, my DOM. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to catch this observable here. And instead of subscribing, my results is going to be an observable that has an array of objects. Oops. Let's see, what am I missing? Oh, it is actually an array of YouTube results. Am I missing something? No?
I think remove the brackets, but the type, the brackets are part of the type, I think, right? The braces and the brackets are both covered in YouTube result.
Which line?
I'm thinking there on 21, if you replace both the braces and the brackets with just YouTube result, I think your interface already has that notation, the braces and the brackets encompassed within the YouTube result. Now I would leave the observable. But
It's
then,
an observable Api
yeah,
result.
I see.
that's right. That's right. That's what I meant. But then I think
Not
take
the
out the
array.
bracket.
Oh, it's items. Okay, yep, I see now. That was a last minute change. Threw me off. Okay, so now I have an observable of YouTube results. And YouTube
They wanna
results. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, they want to know in the chat, what if they use the filter after the debounce time?
For the most part, it would function the same way. The debounce is going to kind of hold off the events until after those 500 milliseconds, and then it would pass on the value. So,
And in this situation, it really is almost exactly the same, because you're probably going to get to your third character before the debounce kicks in because you're typing so fast.
right. Yeah, and this is one of the cases where order doesn't really matter. So it kind of depends on what you're doing. Okay, so I'm, instead of subscribing in my component, I'm just calling or assigning it to a results property. And then in my template here, I'm going to use the async pipe. So this is a kind of handy little feature in Angular. This async pipe will automatically subscribe to your observable. So my results here is my observable object from my API. It's just going to automatically subscribe for me and then pass in my list of results to my template.
This is where I got in trouble with Jeff, because I hadn't learned any of the operators yet. And I was like, but I have to subscribe because I don't know operators.
Yeah, that's where the operators are super helpful, because if you can use these operators, then you don't have to subscribe in your component. And if you use the async pipe and let the async pipe subscribe for you, whenever that component is destroyed, so if it's like, say, hidden with an ngIf or you route to a different view, the async pipe automatically unsubscribes for you as well. So you don't have to worry about catching the subscription, calling .unsubscribe.
And I like this because you end up with this beautiful, tiny little component that just looks so elegant. It's great.
So there's actually one last thing I forgot for, I think my types are actually wrong. I'm gonna make this an any. I have to map over the value I get back from the YouTube API because it returns that object with all that metadata. And really all I care about is that list of items. So I use a map. That way my observable returns the list of items and not that metadata. So now my observable in my template is actually a list of search results and not all that extra stuff YouTube provides. Search now I get my cat videos. So that's pretty much it for the demo. What's really neat about RxJS is it does kind of have a learning curve to it, but once you kind of start to slowly build up your tool belt of operators, you can build out some really cool features with just a handful of operators. So we've got the search feature that handles debouncing, efficient network calls, it cancels prior requests, which are super helpful for mobile performance. It kind of does all this work in just a few lines of code.
It's beautiful. And it looks, that's what I love about this. It just looks so neat and clean and orderly and elegant. And it actually does a lot, but it's not that much code.
Yeah, it's like very dense code. That's kind of like how Paul phrases it. I think in the last one, it's not very much code, but it's very dense. It's doing a lot of things. Each one of these operators has a lot of functionality, which is a really good thing for us because I know for me, I've had to write a debounce function before, and it's really hard. It's not fun, and if it's my code, it's full of bugs. So it's really nice to be able to just like grab this function, and it's unit tested by someone else. I just know it's going to work. So it's really helpful.
Yeah, this is really cool. This was an awesome demo. I couldn't have written it better myself. It's so cool. It's funny to me that we just went through like the same things and taught the same things. So, but this is perfect because, I mean, you've gone through enough. You know, you went through the subjects and behavior subjects and how it all works, and enough operators that. Oh, I guess I should take you off.
Oh, there we go.
The cool thing about that is that when you have just enough, you can go ahead and start using RxJS, and you can continue learning more operators as you go along. But this is a really good for anybody who's just getting into it, that they can now take it and run with it and learn the rest as they go.
Yep, definitely.
This was awesome. Panel, you guys have any more questions?
No, that was great. Appreciate it.
We kind of asked them all along as you went along.
Yeah, they're all great questions.
Right.
Yeah. What I want to add though is I worked in Angular for Angular 2 for a couple of years before I really understood the power of the reactive side of things. At least, definitely early on, the documentation didn't really emphasize it, and they still don't emphasize it as much as I'd like. I went for quite a while without actually understanding the power of reactive forms and how to use the operators when they came out of, or how to use values when it comes from HTTP, and how to really leverage the async pipe and all of these things. It's kind of buried behind the surface, but observables are everywhere in Angular. And to really become fluent as an Angular developer, there will be a level of observables that you'll have to understand. And I think that might be part of the reason that they didn't really emphasize it at first, because, well, one thing, RxJS is not an internal part of Angular, but the other thing is, yeah, there are 120 operators, and it can be overwhelming and intimidating. But as some of the links that we've shown here indicate, you can start small and build in. And when you do that, and when you work with reactive forms, when you work with your event emitters, when you work with something like ngRx, you really have a lot of power that is not obvious at the beginning.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we did this, because we've actually had a couple of RxJS talks on ngHouston before that were a little bit tricky. And this one is just like, now it's not intimidating anymore. And even if you've never done it before, it's just, this is like super, now it's easy. Anybody can do this. That was great, Cory. Thank you so much.
Cool. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah,
thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good point about the reactive forms, Lance, because I know with reactive forms, I mean, once you understand this stuff, that value changes is just, it's so simple and beautiful to, get that observable right out of the reactive form. And it's super handy because, yeah, I used to do stuff like this, and it took a lot more code back then because I had to write all that functionality myself. So this is super easy, and this was fun. So Denny, Vernon, y'all have any more questions before we wrap it up? Are we done? I know we went way over our time, but it was worth it. It was fun.
I have a one good question quota a day.
Well, that one about the network latency was a good question, because he does that. He, like, if you know how to do that, it's just like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna click. But if you don't know, it's like, wait, go back. That was cool. So yeah, that was awesome. Okay, well, thanks again, you guys. Thanks for the panel, and thanks for Cory. That was a great demo, and I know there's a lot of people out there that are gonna be super hyped about that. So thank you.
No problem.
And I think next week we're gonna meet in person, and I don't think we're gonna live stream that. But we're going to be back. Actually, I don't know what's going on the week after that. Okay. So next week we're going to be meeting in person here in Houston, and I don't think we're going to live stream it, but the week after that we're off for Christmas. And then on January 4th, you guys know who I have. I'm super excited. We have Brandon and Mike coming on to talk about ngRx. And the last time Brandon and Mike came on, I was excited. But I hadn't really learned ngRx yet, so I was kind of watching, but I was like a deer caught in headlights because I didn't know half of what they were talking about. But now I've been using ngRx, so I'm super excited. And they're going to come and show us schematics and all kinds of new stuff, and it'll be really cool. So January 4th, come back, and we'll have Mike and Brandon talking about ngRx. It's going to be awesome. Okay, well, that's it for tonight. Thank you again, Cory. That was a really good show. I like it. That might be one of my favorites. It was awesome.
Cool. Thanks.
And we'll see y'all next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.